So I'd like to welcome you here today. And this is the second of our Discovering Buddhism classes on thought transformation or transforming problems. And the approach of this particular class is not academic. So we're really inviting us all to participate in terms of our own experience, sharing experiences as much as we can. And this is because these particular teachings are precisely geared towards transforming our own lives in very real, very concrete, and very wonderful ways. And so in order for that kind of direct application to occur, we have to be prepared to swing the torch of awareness, if you like, back onto ourselves and to begin to develop methods for discovering our mechanisms that are driving our behavior, our response to experience, and particularly our response to other beings, to other people. So you can see here that even at the very beginning of the topic, beginning to approach the topic, we're engaging the tissue, the substance, the reality of our everyday lives. And so this topic is really, really unique because it refuses, if you like, to have a distinction or even a disjunction of any kind between what we might call a spiritual pursuit or practice over here and our daily pursuits for happiness in our lives. And so it's a way of blending the two into the most wonderful, cohesive whole, so that every action that unfolds, whether a body, speech, and mind, which are our three doors of action, become infused with the spiritual techniques of thought transformation, and at the same time enable us to most skillfully navigate the various trials and tribulations of everyday life, which, as we know, can be very, very powerful and very real. And so many of these particular investigations that will be going on together will involve almost a collision course with our own habitual self-focused mind. And so I think it's very important at the beginning of this subject not to at any point in time think that in looking at how this very preoccupied mind works, that we're somehow criticizing or condemning ourselves. We're not. We're simply trying to be realistic about what it is that obstructs our free openness in our relation to others and the world. What blocks us from actual participation in life, in other words? And so key to this topic is the way in which we often desperately and in vain attempt to construct these edifices of projected world realities that are no more than the screening of our own very, very limited fantasies about who and what is out there. And so we're kind of looking at the self cherishing in this regard, in this Buddhist sense, in a very, very special way. It's a kind of unnatural, because exaggerated, clinging to this one, often through fear, often through ignorance, even through hatred, kind of inverse hatred, as we can explore. And it's this fear that we're going to lose control of this one, this very tight this one, that it causes us to respond in all sorts of powerful, unskillful manners, such as generating anger, jealousy, pride, attachment, so that we can't bear to be separated from the objects that we've set up around ourselves. We can't bear them to change, even one iota, because that's not the way they're meant to be. All of these problems are in the face of the reality of our situation, but the limited eye clinging doesn't allow ourselves to see that. So when we say we're going to be swinging the torch or the spotlight back onto ourselves, this is actually a very exciting proposition, because it's going to show us the ways in which meditation, particularly, is not in any way distinct from a very healthy, healing, therapeutic process of self-care and self-transformation. So in the thought transformation lineages, we have many, many instructions that have been handed down with great care from teacher to student over centuries of practice, leading right back to the historical Shakyamuni Buddha. And so the only way these teachings have been preserved in such a vital manner is because the ones who have received them, made themselves sort of available to hear these teachings in some way, have sincerely endeavored to put them into personal use, personal practice. And it's on that basis that the wisdom surrounding and supporting the teachings is able to be transferred to the next generation. So it's really a privilege from that point of view to be able to hear and share these incredible teachings together, which of course we do through the great kindness of our teachers. So I'm going to frequently be quoting His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Kabje Zopa Rinpoche and so forth in the course of our classes together, because it's a way of paying tribute to the incredible gift that they have offered us. So we'll just spend a moment in reflection, just consolidating, if you like, the fact that we're here together, this moment. And from the depths of our heart, we seek refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the community of practitioners and we do this in order to ourselves be able to generate the most precious mind of awakening, bodhichitta, which is the rarest of minds, the most extraordinary of minds, the most precious mind that can lead us to full enlightenment on behalf of all our suffering mothers, all sentient beings, not leaving one single being out. So even to muster this ambition in these few moments together now is a very wonderful and remarkable thing. And it's through the power of such aspirations that we can generate the momentum to actually take step after skillful step towards achieving this great goal, this highest of aims, based on great compassion and great love, flowing spontaneously from our hearts. Let us spend a moment settling and intensifying these thoughts, savouring as well the incredible preciousness of our current opportunity. We're not being swept away by floods or crushed by earthquakes and so forth at this moment. There are so many perils in the world. so many uncertainties. So at this amazingly rare moment when we find all the conditions for practice perfectly assembled, we should really resolve to practice to the very best of our capacity. And with that, we can formally begin the session. So it's really is wonderful to be here and to have this opportunity of sharing some time with you. I just want to quickly cover some of the ground we invoked last week. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said that the purpose of studying, in our case, the 8 verses of thought transformation, which are sort of the epitome, the quintessence of the thought transformation lineages, is so that we can practice ourselves bodhichitta, the altruistic intention to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of sentient beings. So His Holiness goes on, he says, the point I wish to make here is that the practice of compassion is at the heart of the entire path. All other practices are preliminary to it, or a foundation for it, or they are subsequent applications of this core practice. And Shantideva, the great saint who wrote the very beautiful and moving book called The Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which is also one of the main vessels for the carrying of this particular lineage of thought transformation, writes, there is no doubt that those with the nature of compassion regard all these beings, referring to all beings, the same as themselves. Furthermore, those who see this Buddha nature as the nature of sentient beings see the Buddhas themselves. Why then do I not respect sentient beings? What an incredibly amazing passage that is. And it's really sort of saying that if we can see that every single being without exception has an absolutely equal capacity to spiritually transform, to overhaul thoughts that are destructive and causes of pain and so forth, and instead develop minds that lead towards liberation and enlightenment, then on what basis do we distinguish, critically, prejudicially distinguish between the importance of myself and the importance of the others? And so this fundamental equality in Buddhism, particularly emphasized in these teachings, requires that we do find ways and means of becoming closer and closer to this ability to embrace the concerns and needs of others with the same fervor, spontaneously, that we generate for ourselves. And this is the tension of these techniques, because as soon as we begin to contemplate this prospect, some part of us will instinctively pull back and say, hey, Ross, all very well as an ideal, but what about me? Am I going to be lost in this process? And so am I going to end up surrendering or somehow forfeiting my own dignity, my own rights, my own capacity to forge my own direction, and so forth? And so these are really important quandaries, if you like, to allow ourselves to think, because in a very important way, they represent the coalface of the limited capacity we have to quickly change. We sort of hit the wall at this point, if you like, and fall back onto old ways if we're not careful. And so we listen to those fears and those thoughts and those anxieties honestly and openly. And then using these techniques that we're going to be exploring together, we work out ways of flipping them over into their opposites. So that a moment of anger, for example, which we may generate all too easily, if we're aware, because we've trained in thought transformation techniques, becomes a unique moment to undercut that angry mind and completely supplant it with the incredible mind of love towards that person who just a moment ago was an object of anger or rage. And so there's an incredible scope here for becoming more and more psychologically aware of the mechanisms of our own mind using these techniques. And so it's really, from that point of view, very, very important to treat these teachings with a great deal of respect and to give ourselves some time to become familiar with them. So I'm just going to read the 8 verses and then we'll focus on the first. So this is available in our readers pack, which is connected to the web link for the unit. With the wish to achieve the highest aim, which surpasses even a wish-fulfilling gem, I shall train myself at all times to cherish sentient beings as supreme. Whenever I interact with others, I shall view myself as inferior to all, and I shall train myself to hold others superior from the depths of my heart. During all activities, I will probe my mind, and as soon as an affliction arises, since it endangers myself and others, I shall train myself to confront it directly and avert it. When I encounter beings of unpleasant nature and those oppressed by intense negative karma and suffering, as though finding a treasure of precious jewels, I shall train myself to cherish them, for they are so rarely found. When others out of jealousy treat me wrongly with abuse and slander, I shall train to take the defeat upon myself and offer the victory to others. Even if one whom I have helped or in whom I have placed great hope gravely mistreats me in hurtful ways, I shall train myself to view that person as my sublime teacher. In brief, I shall train myself to offer benefit and joy to all my mothers, both directly and indirectly, and respectfully take upon myself all the hurts and pains of my mothers. By ensuring that all this remains undefiled from the stains of the 8 mundane concerns, and by understanding all things as illusions, I will train myself to be free of the bondage of clinging. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kabje Zopa Rinpoche, my own teacher, Gendoga, here in Tara Institute in Melbourne, all are exactly alike in asking us to recite the 8 verses of thought transformation daily as a part of our spiritual practice. And particularly if we can contemplate them initially in the morning, when we start to sort of muster our wherewithal for our daily activities, it sets the scene in a very, very wonderful way for navigating that day in a special way. So last week, we touched upon the first verse, so I'll read that out on its own. With the wish to achieve the highest aim, which surpasses even a wish-fulfilling gem, I shall train myself at all times to cherish sentient beings as supreme. So I'm just going to quickly run over that again. We mentioned how in these thought transformation techniques, we're being asked to view other beings as wish-fulfilling gems, not just ordinary beings, but as wish-fulfilling gems, because it's our contact with them that enables many, many important things to occur. So wish-fulfilling jewels and sentient beings can be said to be alike in two particular ways, according to Geshe Chekawa in his commentary on this verse. He says, for a Mahayana practitioner, especially, it is due to other sentient beings that you can generate great compassion, the higher spiritual principle. And it is thanks to other sentient beings that you can develop bodhichitta, the altruistic intention. So it is on the basis of your interaction with others that you can gain the highest spiritual realizations. From this point of view, the kindness of others is very profound. I'll just stop here for a moment to comment. It's bears a lot of thought, this point, because if given our current chronic approach to being who we are is allowed just to sit and exist on its own without any interaction or without any challenge, what happens? Does radical transformation occur? It's a good question. I think we'd have to say no. We simply ossify, petrify, freeze up, become sedimented, trapped even more so by the limits of our perspectives, because there is nothing to enrich them, nothing to challenge them, and nothing to trigger their transformation. And so from this perspective alone, our encounter with others is crucial to the vibrancy, the vitality of any transformational practice in which we engage. And so this gives you a unique handle, if you like, to look at the way in which these lojong, these thought transformation teachings, are in every way involved in discussing and exploring the mode of our relationships with other beings. It's not some isolated spiritual pursuit that happens in a kind of ether that has no content, no magical space at all. It's the very terrain of our lived experience and our lived encounters with others that is the rich source of our spiritual practice and transformation. And so already this, I think, gives us a completely different prospect of what being a Buddhist might be from this point of view. Not to say that these thoughts and these teachings are unique to Buddhism, but Buddhism celebrates them for very particular reasons, because if we can begin to treasure other sentient beings, we begin to respond to them in productive ways that benefit both them and ourselves as a corollary. So Geshe Chekawa also gives another way in which sentient beings can be seen as similar to a wish-fulfilling jewel. And in the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, just as a wish-fulfilling jewel can't be cleansed of mud, obscuring its clarity or purity without our agency, washing it and so forth, sentient beings cannot be helped to escape from the mire of this unenlightened state without our help and support. They remain like unwashed gems. Therefore, we train to muster the great motivation, as Shantideva says. He says, "May I be a doctor and the medicine, and may I be the nurse for all sick sentient beings in the world until everyone is healed." So the healing here, of course, is washing, helping to wash the dirt from the inherent Buddha nature that is the birthright, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls it, of each and every sentient being. This is the foundation of a fundamental ethics of care for others. So His Holiness says that this goal of aspiring towards enlightenment on behalf of others surpasses even the legendary wish-fulfilling jewel, because however precious such a jewel might be, it cannot provide the highest spiritual attainment. And so this is sort of unpacking the analogy of the wish-fulfilling jewel in sort of Tibetan culture, for example, that someone would be seen to possess a magical stone. And if you held that stone and made a prayer, "May I become a millionaire overnight," that wish would be fulfilled. And so it was a kind of stone that was seen to have magical capacities to grant our wishes. So this is, a wonderful sort of image, isn't it? So on one occasion, actually, I used to collect stones when I was a boy. I grew up in Broken Hill, outback Australia, in a desert region, and stones were prominent in the desert. They were everywhere, and they were some of the most ancient stones. In fact, they are the most ancient stones exposed on the surface of the earth because of the age of the Australian landmass. And there were all these incredible forms of crystallization that would occur. And so you'd find crystals of various kinds on the surface, glinting in the sun, in the red dust of the desert. And so I used to collect them and make little gardens out of them. And when I met Kabje Zopa Rinpoche in 1983 at a Buddhist meditation course in Bendigo, a town outside of Melbourne, at the end of that course, because he gave me a stone in a little tiny, beautiful little bag with a little drawstring, and told me that it was a wish-fulfilling stone. So, of course, I was delighted. I was on my first meditation course. I've been given a wish-fulfilling stone by this extraordinary teacher who I just met. And it had a seed syllable tum written on it in green. And it had come from Lake Tara, apparently, in Tibet, and a lake that has sacred powers of High Lamas can read visions of the future in the glass-like surface of the lake. So, to cut a long story short, I had to think to myself, how do I use this stone? I've been given it. And it hit me at some point, you'll be glad to know, that I realized that it was none other than the mind of bodhicitta that I'd been given. Not to say I have a mind of bodhicitta, but I've been given the key to unlocking the mind of bodhicitta by Lama Zopa Rinpoche when he handed me that gift. And the uncanny part of that story is that he knows a stone lover when he sees one. The fact that he gave me a precious stone fitted exactly into my kind of personal cosmology, the way I'd collected meaning in my own private universe up to that time. And so he opened that door to that, to begin to consider the entirety of things. And so I have this precious stone with me as we speak. It's a wonderful thing to have, but I've learned not to see it as something I'm going to use to win Tats Lotto. It's equivalent of, you know, your big lotteries in America, but to only make the very purest and highest wishes with it. And so it's forced me to try to synthesize and extract what it might be that I'd actually like to wish for. And so the greatest wish, which is at the basis of these thought transformation teachings, is to work out how best to alleviate and rescue other sentient beings from their plight. And this is done in a completely non-patronizing manner. And so we're going to be able to explore how that might this be. So in this first verse, it also mentions, I shall train myself at all times to cherish sentient beings as supreme. And so I just want to spend a moment on this, at all times. We don't just think of sentient beings as precious on occasion when we meet them, for example, and particularly when they give us something good. Oh, you're wonderful. Should just give me a birthday cake. I really wanted a birthday cake this year. So I missed out last year. I was actually feeling a bit bitter about it because my family had not only forgotten my birthday, but forgotten my cake. I'm just joking here. This is how we think. Suddenly someone gives me a cake and I go, oh, this is the person I love. This is my special person. Thank you so much. We're together in harmony this moment. It's very, very beautiful. The challenge here is to see other sentient beings as precious at all times, without ceasing. And this also means that we're going to see them as precious, even if, according to our limited view, based on a self-clinging, that person is appearing as somehow obstructive or unpleasant, as somehow thwarting our prospects, our progress. Even that one, according to these thought transformation teachings, is to be treasured as supreme. Indeed, in important ways, they are the most supreme because they are the ones who are the only ones who are kind enough to point out that we're still capable of getting angry. We're still capable of feeling jealousy. We're still capable of being mean, self-absorbed, and so forth. And so it's the teacher, the guru, if you like, the Buddha, manifesting as our enemy in this case, our sort of obstructor of our personal happiness, who is pointing out our own personal lack of spiritual quality and transformation. And so when in the beginning we make an aspiration to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings, it's said that if we leave one sentient being out of that wish, we have broken our promise to become enlightened for their benefit. Just leaving one person out constitutes a breakage of that aspiration. This is really, really something very important to consider. And it suddenly hits us, doesn't it, that if we're the one person, for example, who you've left out, because you've suddenly decided you don't like me because I didn't give you a birthday cake, it's rotten for me. I'm left unsupported, neglected, even despised by you, because you've decided to subtract me from your field of concern for some personal reason that you've conjured based on what Buddhism is going to suggest are afflicted minds, deluded minds, unskillful states of mind. So the whole dimension or proportion of our prejudices and their operation can be measured in this space where our commitment to the happiness of others falls down by making an exception. And probably more importantly, we don't just make an exception by forgetting someone in the field of our concern, but unfortunately, in many ways, we eliminate people from our field of concern. And so we leave a trail of abandoned people behind us as we make our magnificent egotistical progress through our brittle, desperate private universe, if you like. We leave a trail of injury and damage behind us. And of course, we can write it large on a global scale to do with, plundering resources for our benefit, while knowing that other people needed that river not dammed so that they could water their own rice paddies and eat every day. So you can see here that these sorts of issues resonate in all governmental systems, not just personal governmental systems, but national and so forth. And we just keep expanding out. These teachings have incredible value for a kind of responsible, ethical politics as well. So I just mentioned that in passing. So when we say I should train myself at all times, it necessarily means now. Now is always now. We utilize every single moment we can to train in thought transformation. And from this perspective, the possibility of experiences arising becomes exciting. It's to be treasured. We embrace experience, whether it's perceived as sort of difficult or easy or relaxed or tense and so forth. We look at ways in which we can work with that and transform it. So as I mentioned before, that example of hatred is a good one, isn't it? Because it's in that very moment of sending out a ray of hatred to demolish our object that if we could undercut that mind in the very moment that we're sending it out, that shows the most incredible spiritual power to transform and take responsibility for ourselves. It's very easy to generate a wafty universal love feeling towards all beings when we're sitting in the calm of a meditation room, but it's much more difficult, as some of the lineage lamas tell us in stories, to generate that feeling when we're in the busy marketplace, the very bustle and complicated bustle of our daily affairs. So His Holiness says that this commitment to training myself at all times has to start now, because now is here with us, and it involves engaging in the 3 higher trainings. And the first one, of course, is morality. And the essence of morality is not harming others. So you can see here we already have the most expansive practice presented to us as the very first step of a spiritual pursuit. At least don't harm others. And then we enhance our sort of spiritual growth through meditation and concentration, developing a true insight into the nature of reality. So His Holiness says the essence of Buddhist training in morality is the ethics of restraint. That is, refraining from harming others, and the core practice, refraining from the 10 non-virtuous actions, the first of which is not to kill. So the very first practice of ethical discipline, not to kill, is directly connected with the value of the role played by others. So we're entering an ethical relationship here straight away. There's no avoiding it. If we don't value others, if we don't cherish others, and particularly if we don't cherish other sentient beings as supreme, as more worthy, more precious than ourselves in this sense, we'll have no reason, this is shocking, no reason not to kill them. There's a Jewish philosopher called Emanuel Levinas. Some of us may know his work, and he was very closely connected to well, sort of caught up in the horrors of the Holocaust. And out of that encounter with the incredible brutality and horrific decimation of people in the death camps, he evolved a philosophy where he said that the fundamental ethical encounter is when we come face to face with another person, is not to kill. That is the fundamental ethical encounter. All other ethical possibilities can be built on that basis. It's very difficult if that basis isn't observed. And so I've always I've often reflected on this image of face to face. It means that we directly encounter situations all the time. So that's what we mean by face to face. So how do we respond to a situation, and particularly our encounter with another, in that moment of encounter? This is where our practice is dynamically engaged, right at that moment. And so His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when you observe him, expresses joy and delight. It ripples up in waves as soon as he sees another person approaching. And so this is really the model of thought transformation in action. His Holiness the Dalai Lama doesn't have to kind of know all the details and backgrounds of that person. We might say that he does already because he has special clairvoyant powers and so forth. But the point I'm making is that his responsive care for that person is immediate. As soon as he sees them face to face, he's right there with concern for them. One of the most moving examples of this for me was during some teachings, some ceremonial events at Drepung Monastery. And His Holiness, as he entered into the debating hall where was being used for the large gathering of students, encountered a row of very, very old Tibetans, many of whom were facing death, imminently facing death. And he spent an enormous amount of time and care stopping to talk to each of those people and to gently hold their heads and to blow mantras of compassion onto them. And of course, many of those old people were sobbing because this for them was the most wondrous gift that they could be given at this moment. They knew they were dying. That's why they were there in the front row of the entrance hall on the prospect that they might actually be able to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And His Holiness showed absolute focus on each and every one. And so we were all sitting in the hall waiting. We'd been waiting for a long time already because there were a lot of people there, but nothing was going to hold up His Holiness from spending that time in that way. And so for me, that was, I didn't need to listen to the teachings that came after that really, because that was the teaching. If we could seek to emulate that kind of concern and intimacy, it would be a very wonderful thing indeed. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts that are sort of coming up, or examples of these things from our own experience that would like to share? It's sort of the opposite, isn't it? When we see someone we don't like, the shackles start going up as soon as we hear their voice. If we, trying to examine ourselves, we're tensing up, we're tightening up, we're blocking off, we're building the edifices of self-protection and stay awayness, even before they've arrived face to face. They're coming towards us, but they're still not near us. And so by the time they get here, it's already too late for us to reach over and have some genuine concern for that person, because we've already, in very real ways, dismissed them, prevented them from getting any closer, certainly from relying on us as a source of aid or support. So from this point of view, sentient beings, Sheila, do you have a question or a comment? Sheila's hand's up. So anyway, if you'd like at any point to say something, turn your microphone on and just jump in. So I'm really, really open to having a chat in that way. So His Holiness gives us a caution when navigating this first verse, because he says it is not an invitation to self-pity. So when we say we're to view all other sentient beings as supreme, does this mean that somehow we're going to leave ourselves out? And that kind of leaving ourselves out becomes a form of self-pity, feeling sorry for ourselves. And so we're not being asked to leave ourselves out or to feel sorry for ourselves. We are being asked to overhaul. It says the host is not allowing participant to unmute. Michael, can you unturn your...
I just fixed that. I just fixed it.
Yeah. All right, now.
Now I'm able to.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks.
I just wanted to get your input on this. I'm not sure where I heard, but like you were talking about when we see somebody, our mind goes into I like or I don't like.
Yeah.
And so like it's that duality of like I don't like we just automatically categorize experiences. Is there a way, like, is the 8 verses of transformation trying to show us how to not have that dualistic mind? So when we see somebody, if like our mind goes into I don't like, we change it into, oh, but this was my mother at one point.
Yes, that's a wonderful example, actually. And yes, it's exactly that. There are a whole number of techniques that are provided within these teachings that will help us move towards that goal. And so the immediate issues that come up are very directly connected to us, because we have our own psychological blockages that are making those triggers fly very, very quickly. It's often fascinates me with, in the new sort of digital media, how liking and disliking is actually enabling these mechanisms to be enhanced and developed. You know, we dismiss someone by not liking them, we'll dismiss a point of view by not liking it, and the opposite. And
Like,
that's it. It's kind of, it's a technology, isn't it, almost? And we're doing that same thing in daily life. Yeah.
what I wonder is it innate? Like, are we born innately, where our consciousness has this I like, I don't like? I often wonder, like, is it possible to like, because there's so many experiences coming to us, right? And so many people we meet all the time, that it would be mentally exhausting to keep saying, oh, but this was my mother, or this person is just like me, that experiences suffering and wants to be happy. Like, is this something, if we keep training our mind, that eventually it will not have the dualistic I like, I don't like?
Exactly. In fact, what we take to be instinctive behavior from a Buddhist perspective is actually the impact of previous actions. And so the imprints of those previous actions are providing a kind of momentum towards us relating to experiences in a particular way. So to cut a long story short, if I allow my anger to run unbridled without restraint, my capacity to fly off the handle at the merest thing will be enhanced. So I'm actually training myself, whether I realize or not, in advanced anger generation. It comes more and more easily, more often, in more situations, towards more things. And we do meet people, don't we, sometimes, who appear to just be radiating anger. They're just like an explosion waiting to happen. You say one word to them, they misunderstand it because they can't hear it because they're already angry, and they fly out at you. So Buddhism says that this isn't an innate problem for this person, but it appears to be, because they've inculcated through habit their closeness to that mind generation of anger so frequently, so many times, in so many situations, that it appears to arise as though spontaneously. However, it can be cut at its root. It can be totally overcome if we take a step back and begin to work on how we might do that. And so the analogies, I think it's a very useful analogy, is given of scraping a nail backwards and forwards in a piece of wood. The more we do that in the same way, that's equivalent to generating anger over and over again, the deeper the groove is, and the harder it is for that nail to leave the groove. And so we're actually producing the circumstances of compulsive behavior with limited and increasingly limited choices by the unskillful repetition of those destructive modes of behavior. Now, fortunately, there's the other side of the coin, a very wondrous side, which is that likewise, if we train in love and compassion, their capacity to arise spontaneously in each and every situation towards each and every being and so forth will happen more and more easily, more and more spontaneously. And so one would have to say that in the case of, you know, a sort of fully realized being like His Holiness, he doesn't see someone and says, oh, that person would be nice if they had happiness and didn't suffer. He automatically sees a person who he cares about and wishes for them not to suffer and to have complete happiness. There's no secondary mental work required to generate that relationship, because the work has been done in deep meditation and spiritual practice prior to that moment. And so this is really a clue as to the efficacy of our spiritual practice. If we judge it immediately, you know, I've meditated today about anger and I'm still angry tomorrow, we might make the mistake, and people do, unfortunately, of concluding that meditation doesn't work, or I can't work with my anger using meditation because it doesn't work. This is a wrong way of looking at the situation. Each time we meditate on transforming anger, we gain greater and greater capacity to work at more and more subtle levels with that situation. And so, for example, rather than blurting out words of anger, if we've trained ourselves using the thought transformation techniques, we'll feel the impulse to generate harsh words in the tightening of our throat muscles and our chest before we've even begun to speak. And that registration of that sensation, if you like, which is very much a physical sensation in this case, is the perfect moment to pull back and think, hey, why not send out a word of tenderness or care at that moment rather than a weapon, a missile that will fly out of my mouth uncontrollably. And so we become more and more aware. So Shantideva in his text, Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life, says, for example, it's best or easier to put out a spark than it is a fire. And he gives the analogy of a spark in a bed of straw, where we might be a tinderbox waiting to explode into anger, and we have the spark, which has suddenly been lit by our encounter with an unpleasant object. If we can extinguish that moment of the beginnings of the generation of that anger trajectory, if you like, it's equivalent to stepping on the spark that would otherwise enable a massive conflagration and the burning down of the barn. So by the time the barn's burning, it's too late, isn't it, in very important ways to undo the damage that has already been done. As soon as the words fly out, they're going to land on their target and potentially cause grievous injury. And so part of our responsible approach to our spiritual practice is to try to skillfully work with that situation in all of the stages of its unfolding, trying to intercede skillfully as best we can. And so we can take that scenario away and sit down and meditate, for example. I'm just giving this an example, on that very person by placing them in the space in front and then allowing ourselves to admit to how we feel about them, and then thinking they are our precious mothers. However, I could be that person in someone else's meditation. How wonderful it would be if I could love and care for them instead of wishing to hurt or obstruct them, and then allow ourselves to generate love towards them, and then feel delight and conclude the meditation. And I just know from my own experience, my limited experience, that if we do proceed in this way, when we do encounter that person next, there is a kind of experiential space there, which wasn't there before. Has anyone else had this experience? There's a kind of scope to come in from different angles, in different ways, to work with the situation that wasn't there before, when we just allowed that rabid, harmful emotional response to well up. And so Buddhism says that no sentient being is innately evil or innately bad or innately kind of harmful and so forth. All of these are the products of disturbing states of mind, which at their very base are grounded on a fundamental misreading of the nature of reality. So if we can transform and overhaul our perception of how things appear and how they exist, and also work with the conditions of the uprising of our experiences as they occur, we can definitely totally eliminate all of those harmful minds that obstruct us from caring for others. There's no limit to love. It's a remarkable thing. There is a limit to hatred in the sense that it can only be there for as long as the conditions for hatred are there. But love, because it's based on a sound foundation, can be infinitely cultivated and grown. So this is how we look at the possibility of Buddha nature sort of ripening as Buddhahood in each and every being. Yeah.
Ross,
Yeah.
I'm just sort of thinking about what you just said, and one of the things
Yeah.
that confuses me with
Mm-hmm.
with this practice is, say, for example, throughout the workday, your anger arises, and you
Mm.
mentioned that, in meditation, you can work on it. And I think this has always confused me. What,
Mm.
like you did say that when you sit in meditation, and if, you know, anger arose or whatever, um, disturbing emotion came up, when you're sitting in meditation, is that a different meditation when you are observing your breath? That's one meditation. And this one is specific for transforming your mind in terms of like dealing with what happened earlier. So you bring that to center, like you bring that person in front of you, and then
Mm.
extend like love, compassion. Can you clarify that a little bit, please?
And I think you're onto it completely. That's exactly what we do. We don't only do that, but that is one of the things we do. One of the things we can do. So when we, for example, haven't handled a situation very skillfully,
Yeah.
uh, we recognize that openly and honestly. We don't then use that to whip ourselves and condemn ourselves as a failed good person or a failed Buddhist or a failed anything. But we take it as an opportunity to see if we can transform ourselves going forward so that those sorts of situations won't be strengthened or repeated easily. And on the basis of that wish, we can choose to elect to place that person with whom we had trouble with at work in the morning into our meditation that evening, so that when we meet them the next day, there is this scope for an alternative approach opened up to us. And that's very, very subtle. I know just my own sort of clumsy experience that in the meditation of friend, enemy, and stranger we do, where we look at three beings in the space in front in our meditation, one of whom is an enemy, so-called, one who's a friend, so-called, and one who's a stranger, so-called. We attempt to equalize our concern and care for each of those three beings without discrimination, without partiality. And there are ways of doing this in the meditational visualizations that are very, very special. But one of the techniques involved can be feeling our lovely feelings of warmth towards the friend in the meditation, just seeing our friend there. We love you. We know how much you care for me and I care for you. And then suddenly swap the visualization with the enemy in the space in front and see what happens to that feeling. Can we sustain that feeling at that moment of swapping the object, or does it collapse? Incredibly interesting thing to do, isn't it? And to some degree, yes, we can extend it until we realize that, wait a minute, we don't want this person to be feeling warm and fuzzy in our presence because we don't like them, or that we know they don't like us. And so we suddenly revise the scenario and start generating negative energy towards them, showing us a lot about how these situations are actually arising from our own mental projection rather than from the side of the object themselves. So from their own side, those three objects, friend, enemy, and stranger, so they're three people, are equally able to be the friend, enemy, and stranger of anyone else's meditation. So are they a friend, really? Are they an enemy, really? Or are they a stranger, really. And so we get a kind of measure here of the degree to which we're conjuring, hallucinating, if you like, that partisan scenario, that prejudicial structure from the side of our own deluded projections. And they're deluded because we don't actually understand who's there. We can't see who's there. Strangers, we barely see at all. Who are strangers? Describe a stranger to me. You can't even describe them because you haven't observed them, because you haven't cared, perhaps. I mean, there's a lot of people, so we can't observe everyone acutely at all times. That's another issue. But the point I'm making is that we don't bother to take care to see the stranger because they're in the stranger category. And we see this reflected in the news. Now, I have a friend who's Sri Lankan, and when the tsunami happened a number of years ago, it was really, really interesting in the way in which the global news dealt with that trauma in terms of particular nations having been struck by the tsunami. It wasn't openly concerned to depict the impact of the tsunami on all peoples, only on some peoples who were seen to be newsworthy. And so this is an example of that partiality operating to obscure the actual situation of the people who are there. And so meditation in this analytical way, using it as an analytical tool in conjunction with visualization, is one of the most potent ways of transforming our awareness of that object, who's actually there. I had an experience that I'm sort of have to be honest here. I was getting in a supermarket aisle and in a string of people waiting to get through the checkout. And someone in front of me was taking an awfully long time to sort of get their bits and pieces together to sort of proceed further on. So in other words, I was getting frustrated that I was being made to wait, according to my perspective, unnecessarily, because I had a right to get out of that shop as quickly as possible, do what I needed to do. And that person was in the road. And then, much to my shame, I must say, they slightly turned around and I realized that they had a very, very significant physical handicap that made it extremely difficult for them to carry out the simplest physical movement. And the moment I saw that, hit me, of course, the capacity of my original mind that was resenting them being slow fell down in the very space where it had appeared. I couldn't sustain that anymore because I suddenly saw the object differently, realistically, in fact. I actually saw what was there. The mind that was feeling that person was simply a blockage to me, only saw that person in terms of their capacity to be a blockage to me. So I wasn't able to be aware. I had to be face to face again with the physical evidence of a disability for it to dawn on me that my perception was completely wrong, but it was also utterly inappropriate. Utterly inappropriate. And so for me, that becomes a kind of parable for the way we're handling situations all the time. And so I think we'd have to say that if we have compassion and we train in compassion and love, when we see someone, it takes very little work, if you like, to see them as affectionate, to see them affectionately and with some sort of closeness. And this is actually taught in the tradition, that if we can generate a very, very strong form of care for others, they will appear precious to us by virtue of appearing. We don't have evidence that they're this way or that way. The very fact that they're there is enough for our concern to be already there and to flow. And so this is sort of an example of the accomplishment of the thought transformation technique, the fact that that concern is open and able to flow. So there's quite a lot of issues floating around this topic. And so when we say train myself at all times, we're also trying to be practical in relation to your question and to work on the nodal points of difficulty in our lives. Like they're very important spots to do our practice upon. And so they're being presented to us all the time in the course of our daily life. And so we don't need to go searching for meditation objects from this point of view. They're being offered to us over and over again. So it becomes a kind of journey of exploration to begin to apply these thought transformation techniques in daily life. I was just going to get back to that example of the boss at work. Well, I had a boss at work who I was sort of alienated from, felt alienated. I felt they were alienating me, and I definitely resolved to alienate them. And I did the friend, enemy, and stranger meditation with them one evening, and I went to work the next day as normal, and I encountered this person in a hallway as normal. But the difference was they began to chat with me about something that had happened to them that day. A perfectly normal chat. And that hadn't happened before. And so when I went home that day, I had to think to myself, is that person the standoffish, awful person I had constructed? That was one question. But the other question was, had the meditation of friend, enemy, and stranger worked in some way that I, at the time, couldn't see? And I think it had. And I wonder, aloud here, whether it was simply the fact that I had approached the possibility of caring for them and not pushing them away, that very practice in meditation had enabled me to walk towards them that morning in the corridor without a clenched mask of stay-awayness manifesting as my face. There was some approachability, some softness, some availability there in my expression that hadn't been there the day before. And even at an unconscious level, this other person could see that and therefore felt that it was free and even safe to have a relaxed, ordinary chat about something that happened in the day. This is a really interesting example, isn't it? So our body language also becomes sort of caught up in these regimes of trying to control things according to our expectations. So bit by bit is the other thing. At all times means bit by bit. We don't attempt to do it all now, all in one day, all in one moment, all in relation to one incident. But bit by bit, as the opportunity arises, we apply the practice. And so if we push too hard, and many people do, especially when they approach Buddhist teachings at the beginning, they have a sort of feeling of discovery and delight. Oh, it's all come together now. This is it. This is it. And then they begin to practice, and a couple of weeks later, things start not working out quite the way they were wanting to, or so forth. And then they do some meditation. That doesn't seem to help. And then they make a rather, in some ways, dreadful decision to abandon the effort of making the techniques work, because they've prejudged them as having failed based on over-emphasizing or over-expectation as to what can be achieved in a very small space of time. space of time. So His Holiness says that the measure of our spiritual practice in this lifetime, for example, is to be able to say on our deathbeds that, yes, I was a kinder person at the end of my life than I was at the beginning. Sort of a very humble achievement and a very, very real one, and a very important one, because in our next life, we'll have a inclination towards kindness that will arise more easily, require less stimulation to be active. And on that basis, we can further enhance it, and then further enhance it, and then further enhance it. So the Buddhist framework here is across lifetimes. So that scale is there on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we work with the minutiae, the exquisite details and circumstances of our daily experience in a skillful way. I might the return to that verse. Another issue that comes up with that verse, cherishing sentient beings as supreme, is that there is a particular mind that we have habitually that obstructs us holding them as supreme, and that is the mind of pride. And pride here is being talked about in a particular way. It's holding ourselves to be supreme. We're so proud in our holding of our specialness of self that we can't allow a perception of specialness of others to invade or threaten that edifice that we've created through pride. So pride blocks us from cherishing other sentient beings, and it also blocks us from cherishing them intensely as special. And so the mind of pride here is an obstacle. So Geshe Sonam Rinchen, in his commentary on this verse, says, this pride is an inflated state of mind and relies on our false identity, our view of the transitory collection, which focuses on the existent self attributed to our body and our mind and distorts it. When we are on top of a very high mountain, we look down on all the lower peaks. Similarly, when we're full of pride, everybody else appears lower. We are the best and everyone else is inferior. This pride, Geshe Sonam Rinchen continues, is self-preoccupation and makes us act inappropriately and disrespectfully towards others, so that we can never develop real concern for them. To counteract this attitude, and this is taking us right to the pith of this first verse, we train ourselves always to think of them as supremely important by considering their good qualities and by viewing or reviewing our own faults and weaknesses. So this is a very, very important passage to consider. So we train ourselves to always think of them as supremely important by considering their good qualities and by reviewing our own faults and weaknesses. What this is involving is swinging back the habitual tendency to judge others, often harshly, but certainly in limiting ways. Swinging that back onto ourselves to look at the way in which we ourselves are driven and riddled with faults and weaknesses. There's no real basis of pride if we're really honest about it, because we are a flawed individual as well. So we're not trying to condemn ourselves here, but we're just trying to say that who are we to judge others so magisterially as though we were at the top of some extraordinarily elevated height looking down? It's just pompous nonsense. The whole thing is a fabrication of our self-concerning mind wishing to hold on to power and resources and so forth for our own exclusive gain in some way. So, in other words, this practice involved in the first verse is very, very effective in undercutting this tendency to pride. And curiously, Buddhism presents a radical take on this, because it says that one of the forms of pride is none other than self-denigration. Does anyone want to offer some reasons why that might be the case? So we're talking about putting oneself down. How can that be a form of pride? It's an inverse pride, because we are committed to being lower, and that's making us special. And so our commitment to our lowlessness, don't know how to put that really, but our denigrated state, our pushed down state, is what we're clinging to and can't let go of. And it's that's preventing us from seeing others realistically. And so in that sense, it's a kind of inverted pride working to push ourselves down. And in that capacity, that regard is inhibiting, obstructing us from developing energetic policies and energetic responses to lived experiences, because we're so involved in being huddled in on this feeling of worthlessness. And so this isn't what's being discussed here or being required of us when we say to hold others supreme. It doesn't mean that we're to put ourselves down into some sort of abject muddle at all. It's really a clarion call to become open to what the situation is in a more expansive way. So Shanti Davis says in chapter 8, verse 36 of his Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the world of sentient beings are a Buddha field. Thus the mighty Lord Shakyamuni has taught. For many who have sought the happiness of others have gone beyond attaining to perfection. And so the sort of crux of this verse, and it's also the crux of the significance of this first verse, is that in holding others supreme, we don't forfeit our own worth or our own value at all. To the contrary, we open the door to developing our potential to its fullest extent. And this ripening of potential comes as a side effect, a kind of spontaneous corollary of our intense concern for others. In that very concern for others, we are also protecting and caring for ourselves in the very best way imaginable. And the inverse of that is that in seeking to protect myself at the cost of the happiness of others, which is the inverse mirror reflection of that cherishing others mind that I just described, is the most unskillful way of proceeding if you want this one to be happy, because it won't and can't deliver its fruits. And so sometimes in the Buddhist texts, we see this kind of mind that's clinging to myself to the exclusion of others as a kind of a demon. It's a sort of an allegory, because it's demonic in as much as it's pretending to be offering us the world, the universe, but it's actually taking it away in that very gesture. That promise that we'll get everything we want if we only look after ourselves is so fake, so inaccurate, yet we believe it when we're intensely self-preoccupied. And that betrays us. It means that we can't actually get to work towards overhauling and transforming our circumstances, because we're entrapped by that limited view. And so from this point of view, again, self-denigration is a form of laziness also, because it prevents us from seeking to act positively in situations. So we've got a little bit of time left. Are there any comments or stories or anything you'd like to share as we go along?
Ross, in this first verse
Yeah.
is, and you may tell me it's both, right? But is it holding others as supreme? Is that me accomplishing the highest aim? Or if I want to accomplish the highest aim, I need to hold others supreme. Because there can be an aim that's even higher than that, but in order to get to that next level, I got to get to this level.
Yeah. It is both. It's really referring to the two limbs of the mind generation of bodhichitta. It has two aspects,
Right.
as we know. It's firstly aspiring to become fully enlightened. That's one aspect. And the second aspect is in order to be able to benefit other sentient beings. And so we cherish other sentient beings as supreme because they have perfect capacity, as we do ourselves and every other being does, of achieving the same great goal of enlightenment. And it's on that basis that we see them as supreme. But we also see our own seeking of enlightenment as supreme, because it's through its instrumentality, its agency, that we're going to be able to most skillfully help to remove the grime from the wish-fulfilling gems of others that's obscuring, their sort of own obscurations of blocking their development of their Buddha nature. And so both of those ways of looking at it are definitely in play at the same time. They support each other. And so if we see sentient beings as potential Buddhas, we can naturally feel that they are supreme, because we're not focusing on their limited appearance. We're focusing on the deeper potential they have. And I think, obviously a carer, such as a parent, for example, knows this so well. By nurturing a child's safety and nourishing their needs as they unfold, enables that child to grow towards fulfilling their potential. Whereas traumatizing that child through harm, physical, mental, or whatever, works against that ripening of the child's virtue. It's not saying that the child is incapable of it, but they're going to have to get all that out of the way somehow in order to continue exploring and transforming themselves. The impact of that kind of lack of care and trauma and so forth are significant. And so these are real issues, real challenges. We might feel these in relation to ourselves. We might have had a difficult period in our life where we kind of lost our sense of direction, our wherewithal, our sense of self-worth and so forth. And so we do need, according to these teachings, to take a little time off, if you like, to look after this one as very, very precious. Because this one in your meditation is the most supreme. And this one, from that wider perspective, can be seen as the most supreme for me too, because I have this potential. And to deny that would be not just a folly, but it would be injurious in certain ways. It would limit my capacity. And so self-love in a more relaxed way is a very positive force here. It's a form of responsibility. And so my teacher, Geshe Doga, often says that if we lack that self-care as our first port of call, how on earth are we going to be able to care for others? So part of this commitment to become enlightened for the benefit of others involves taking stock of the situation and beginning to take care of this one, what this one does, not through selfishness, but in order to begin to explore the possibility of radical transformation that's geared towards benefiting others. And so that's part of the same trajectory, in other words. It's just one aspect of that trajectory that has to be in place for it to occur. Does that answer the question or
Yes.
help a little?
Yeah, absolutely. And do I don't want to say can I take it too far, but I don't know how to better say this. Can I in fact do harm to somebody by cherishing them in that way or cherishing myself? Let's put it on me. Can I do harm to myself by cherishing myself in that way when I know that right now in my life, you said, well, we've had those times when I'm not in one of those times now, but I'm just kind of coming out of one of those times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would I have been doing myself a disservice to cherish myself in that way when what I really needed to do is transform myself?
I don't think they're alternatives. I think they're the same thing. I think, no, I don't think we're only get too complicated here. I think, yeah, how can I put it? The word cherishing gets a bit tricky when we start looking into it. And so there can be a kind of, what should we say, a defective way of cherishing myself, a kind of unskillful way of cherishing myself. And that's that constipating, ossifying sort of way that I described earlier in the class today, where we hold on so tightly that we're impervious to situations and reality. But that's not what we're talking about in the example I just gave about looking after oneself as part of our spiritual practice, because that self-love in this sense, this cherishing ourselves, is a recognition that even if we're having a rough time and this and that are happening, underneath all that, there's this incredible potential for transformation. And so we need to nurture that at that level rather than cling to the reality of the broken one, the one who's feeling like they might shatter or lose everything. If we focus only on that one, we lose perspective. And so by loving ourselves in this sort of more relaxed way, from a Buddhist perspective, we're taking responsibility for ourselves in an important way. And it's on that basis that we can begin to practice other techniques for transformation. with some stability. And this is another reason why His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in that passage I read earlier, talked about the practice of morality as the example of a training that must be engaged at all times. So an example for me in my daily life is that I'm living in an urban area where there's lots of footpaths and lots of streets, and sort of covered in bitumen and concrete and so forth, and lots of footpaths. And when it rains heavily, the earthworms are flushed out of the ground onto the pavement, and then it stops raining. And because of Australia's climate, it can get very hot, very sunny very quickly. And so the earthworms get halfway across the pavement and then begin to dry out. And they struggle at this moment because they're still alive, but they can't crawl. They haven't got sufficient lubrication in their bodies to move in order to get off the pavement to a safe space. And so in my own little way, I attempt to rescue them. I'm just giving this an example of by picking them up carefully in a leaf and then putting them in a slightly moist, safe place so that they can absorb a little bit of moisture and also have immediate access to the earth as a place where they're not going to be eaten by birds and so forth. And while doing that, I dedicate the merits, the virtues of that act towards protecting and caring for each and every sentient being in the same way, both in this and all future lifetimes. So that's just an example of my practice, that practice. I'm not making that up and I'm not special in doing that. This is a basic standard practice. In fact, it's one of the forms of generosity, saving the lives of others. But it takes on an incredible significance when you begin to do it. So I learned to do this, again, I'll tell stories to my shame. I was in Dharamsala, and it was my first time in Dharamsala. It was the first time I had the opportunity of attending teachings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in His Holiness the Dalai Lama's temple. And it was the early days, so that Dharamsala was still very much a Tibetan refugee settlement. And the Tibetans who were there were incredibly devoted to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and incredibly fervent in their practice of Dharma. And to have the Dalai Lama living amongst their midst was, for them, the most wondrous thing possible, and they were fully aware of that. So anyway, to cut a long story short, the first day of teachings was coming up, and I knew the temple was very small, it would only seat so many hundreds of people, and the number of people wanting to attend the teachings was in the thousands. So I thought to myself that I would go early and push my way sort of into a good spot for my cushion. So I got up really, really early and I started heading down the hill towards the temple, and suddenly realized that I was running past all the Tibetans who were on the street. And when I looked again, I realized that most of them were on their hands and knees saving earthworms on the side of the road because they'd been washed there by the heavy monsoonal rains that had occurred during the night. And that was just another example of experience being a source of spiritual practice or mentorship, really. I suddenly realized that to have got first to the temple to get to the best seat would have to have involved running past all of those beautiful, compassionate Tibetans saving earthworms, for whom saving the earthworm was more important than getting the best seat in the temple. And so I'm just giving an example of earthworms in my spiritual practice. They sort of prop up in a number of ways, but yeah, that's really, really extraordinary, isn't it? And so the space that they occupied as they were saving those worms was the very heart of their complete spiritual practice. This Holiness Dalai Lama was there saving earthworms with them. That was what you do. So I think that's an example of cherishing sentient beings as supreme. You could argue that it's a very good illustration of that. Now, verse 2 is, I'll read it out. Whenever I interact with others, I shall view myself as inferior to all, and I'll train myself to hold others superior from the depths of my heart. So we'll look at this next week. And again, it's going to invite us to focus quite directly on the meaning of viewing myself as inferior to all. If we don't interpret that carefully, we're going to come unstuck. So I'm inviting us to begin to think about that as a core issue, really, of interpreting this second verse, and to read His Holiness the Dalai Lama's commentary on this verse, which is available in our reading pack. And you may also have access to some other sources of commentary there. So Geshe Sonnen Rinchen, in his commentary on this verse, I just sort of begin a little bit of commentary, notes once again that one of our main obstacles to practice is pride. And he suggests that pride can be very difficult to recognize. There's pride that makes us feel superior towards inferiors. There's pride towards our equals. And there's pride towards those, towards one superior to us. So we might wonder how the last one is even possible. And Geshe Sonnen Rinchen adds, this is because pride distorts reality and does not accord with fact. Rom Tompa says that the water of good qualities runs off the ball of pride. And so I'm just going to raise the sort of question, to what extent does a form of pride prevent us from exploring the impact and the reach, if you like, of these teachings themselves? To what degree does a certain pride in our commitment to our current view of the world and ourselves and the way things are hinder our capacity to open out to other perspectives? To what extent are we married to a limited view with which we've become very, very much habituated and refuse to give up, and in that sense are proud and determined to maintain? And so I think this is where meditation comes back in, because if we learn to relax in meditation, even with an object as simple as the breath, we recognize that we don't have to be in control all the time in this very tight way just described, this sort of intensely closed, proud way. We can simply allow things to settle, to be. And in that spaciousness afforded by the relaxation of the meditation, we can then begin to forge and determine particular ways of acting in which we'd like to engage, either in that meditation session or when we leave our cushion. So pride in this sense, limited pride, deluded pride, can be let go by relaxing. It's what prevents us from relaxing, you might even want to say, because we're so continuously hugging and holding on to it and refusing to let it change. And that's exhausting us at some level. So the overall resolve of this second verse is to come to the point of realization: I am no higher or above anyone else. That's the crunch. I'm no higher or above anyone else. All the virtuous qualities can blossom on the basis of that realization. In fact, they can only blossom fully on the basis of that realization. So I've only got a few minutes to go in the session, so I won't pursue the verse more today. But I just wanted to share a story which shows you how an enlightened pride might operate, not an unafflicted pride, if you like. And it's the story of Patrul Rinpoche, a very great yogi and teacher and master, who was famous for disappearing and turning up in unexpected situations. Once Patrul was returning from the Zarchulka so that he could circumambulate the Puggy wall. When he arrived, he came to a tent near the wall to ask for shelter. An old blind woman lived there, and she told Patrul that he was welcome to stay. Just a sort of part of this story was that Patrul Rinpoche would travel, wear rags. He wasn't interested in sort of dressing to make an impression or to hold a reputation or to show that he was a special meditation master. Or he could simply wear rags. When he arrived, he came to the tent, asked for shelter, and then Patrul offered to serve as her servant, working for her keep, for his keep. Every day he faithfully served her and made himself useful, making and pouring her tea and emptying out her bedpan, doing whatever needed to be done. Every day the old woman recited prayers aloud, supplicating the most famous Lama, Zuchuka, Patrul Rinpoche, saying, "O Patrul, with your compassion, please think of me." So you can see the situation's already wonderfully absurd because she's invoking the great master to come to her aid when the great master is in her house as her servant emptying her bread pan. Every day, Patrul worked hard as the blind woman's servant. Every day after work, he went to the money wall to circumambulate and do his meditation practice. A month went by in this way. One day, some of Patrul's disciples came to the money wall, saw Patrul doing circumambulations, recognized him, and prostrated to him. The old woman was sitting nearby. Though she was unable to see what was happening, she was able to hear what was being said, and she heard them referring to her servant as Patrul Rinpoche. Learning his true identity, she was embarrassed, and of course would not allow Patrul to continue doing the work as he had been doing. At this, Patrul scolded his students sharply, saying, With your thoughtless prattle, you have done grievous harm to this poor old blind woman. She's lost a good servant, and all because of you. So for me, that's a really, really delightful story. And it's really showing the essence of this second verse in terms of practice. So I'll leave that there. So we might just spend a moment in meditation, just contemplation, drawing the mind inwards. Just contemplate in our own way the great opportunity we have to work with our experience as it unfolds. Not towards limited, but towards expansive aims and outcomes. Thinking how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings had happiness and the causes of happiness. May they have happiness and its causes. May I be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, bless me that this might be so. May all sentient beings be freed from suffering and the causes of suffering. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me that this might be so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings abided in equanimity, free from holding some close and others distant. May they abide in equanimity. May I be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me that this might be so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings without exception achieved only high rebirths and the supreme bliss of liberation. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me that this might be so. So feel the Buddha's blessings arrive in the form of radiant light and nectar, which pours into us through our crown, dissolving away all difficulties and problems. And also ripening the seed of bodhichitta, which is nestled in our heart. Because through nurturing this, we can definitely achieve these great aims. So thank you very much. And I think that will function, Michael, as the dedication prayers for today, because we're sort of giving away the energy. So I'm very happy to be able to spend some time sharing and talking about these things. And I look forward to seeing you again next week.